Hello and welcome to No Rest for the Weekend, where we go behind the scenes and talk to the creators of independent entertainment. I'm Jason Godbey, and with me in the Rabbit Hole Studio today, he is an accomplished entertainment attorney and the man behind Feldshon Law PLLC, Mr. Lee Feldshon. Welcome, Lee.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you so much for having me here today. Any excuse I can get to get out of the office is a real treat. So thank you for this field trip.
It's very cool, man. Glad to have you here. It's a special episode. Normally, I'm talking to directors, I'm talking to actors, I'm talking to producers. So you are not actually what they call a creative in the business, but you work with creatives, I would imagine.
Yeah, so clearly I'm a frustrated actor who became an entertainment attorney, but so I'm living vicariously through my clients.
I think that's, you're probably making a lot more money than frustrated actors do.
On a good day, I do all right.
So what I wanted to kind of get into is, kind of what you do exactly, because I think people have heard of entertainment law and they may have some idea about it, but I don't know if people really know the specifics of what you guys do and how you actually help productions and projects come along, and kind of when does someone need you and when does someone not need you, like at what level kind of thing. And then I will also say off the top that we're not going to ask you anything real specific in terms of having you give legal advice or anything like that. That's a different show. But we'll give you all these information at the end so that you can look him up if you need someone with his expertise. But first, before we get into the nitty-gritty and talk about that stuff, I want to talk about you and kind of get a sense of your background, because you do something completely different than what I do, and I'm always curious to find out how people kind of get into this mess of entertainment. So
yes,
I would ask you, like, how did you come to entertainment law, and what's your origin story, so to speak?
I'm just your friendly neighborhood entertainment attorney. Been an entertainment corporate attorney for over 23 years. Again, originally from New York. And my story is after graduating Columbia Law back in 1994, I started off at a firm called White & Case, big firm, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lawyers there, had a great 4 years, then eventually jumped to a small entertainment law boutique called Levine, Thal, Plotkin & Menon with 9 attorneys, so big culture shock. And then eventually I found my way, luckily, into Radio City Entertainment, Madison Square Garden, where I was Director of Legal Affairs and Business Development, worked on the Rockette agreements out there and the show agreements, and then found my way to forming a partnership with a really close friend of mine. So we practiced together for about 18 years, and now I've got my own shop, Feldshon Law, which is a firm of 3, just me, myself, and I.
In terms of entertainment law, can you tell me like what an entertainment attorney would handle as opposed to a tax attorney or some other kind of corporate attorney?
Sure. Well, an entertainment attorney, just in general, is really a transactional attorney, which means that an entertainment attorney like I am would help you work on the structure of your deal, would help prepare and negotiate the contracts for your project so you can get it up and running, as opposed to, for example, an entertainment litigator, who is someone who would help with litigation in courts or arbitration in front of arbitrators or mediation when something has gone wrong in the agreement and there's a dispute between 2 parties, or, for example, if someone has violated another person's intellectual property rights and they might have to be taken to court or into a tribunal at the Copyright Office. So that's what entertainment attorneys do.
That's a different type of attorney altogether?
Yeah, so for example, I'm purely a transactional attorney. I don't do litigation.
Oh, so you don't go to court?
I don't go to court. I try to keep people out of court, actually.
That's
which
good.
Doesn't mean that I don't try to negotiate settlements and releases if something does go wrong between parties. I can try to do that. When it comes to litigation, I have my go-to people for that.
For the most part, you're setting up deals and setting up the structure of the deal and working through the agreement with both parties. You're talking to, say you're someone like me who's trying to get a deal at a network, trying to pitch a television show, and they buy the television show. Mm-hmm. Someone like you would help negotiate the structure of that deal and make sure that everything's on the up and up on both sides.
That's right. I would, or if you have an agent, your agent would, or both of us would.
Okay.
But normally I would be representing one party in the transaction, so I wouldn't necessarily all the time be dealing with the other party. Other than negotiating with the other party and trying for the 2 attorneys to negotiate a deal together to make things happen. So I'd be representing just one party usually. So for me, it'd be representing, for example, writers, producers, directors, talent in their deals with other parties.
So you don't represent the corporate side. You don't work with the networks and people like that.
No, that's right. I don't represent the networks. They usually have their own in-house counsel and basically like larger firms as outside counsel.
Very cool. So what types of in terms of the stuff that you work on, like we already talked about, helping negotiate deals, but you also would help somebody, for instance, with, like, say you had a feature film project and you wanted to set up an LLC for it, or you wanted to kind of create that structure. You help with that as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, entertainment attorneys in film in particular, we actually help with the rights acquisition stage, where you're trying to get the rights in the screenplay that you want to make into a movie. In pre-production as well, where you actually set up the LLC that's going to be producing the company, set up the C Corp that's going to be a corporation that's going to capture the tax credit. If you're filming in a state that has a tax credit, and it's an incentive to have you film in those states so that they bring the business there and they give you a certain tax amount back, and so it gets captured by the corporation. To do the articles of organization, which is the filing document for an LLC, it's pretty easy to form an LLC. You can do it online. It's a $200 filing fee in New York State, with $10 for a certified copy of the filed articles of organization. And then there's the operating agreement, which is similar to the bylaws of a corporation that really cover how the LLC is run, what powers the managing member has, how the money flows to the LLC, how you dissolve it, and things like that. And then there'll be lots of other pre-production contracts. I mean, I think your first two hires as a film producer, filmmaker, are going to be your attorney and your line producer. Very similar to theater, where you'd want to hire your attorney and your general manager to do the budgets and make sure to line up all those ducks so you have a roadmap as to how you're going to do it.
When does someone in general, like, when do they approach you with a project? Do they come at the very beginning, or do you usually, like, is it the kind of deal where they should come to you at the beginning, but they often come to you later after they probably already should have?
They sometimes come a little bit too early. I mean, a lot of times I'll have people who come my way who actually want me to sort of shop their script. And it's really not something that I do as an attorney. I just unfortunately don't have the time to do that because I have so much actual legal work to do. And also there are some people out there who perhaps aren't as scrupulous when it comes to shopping scripts. They'll take your fee, but it's a question of how much they're doing. So while I'm always happy to try to connect the dots and connect people. If I know someone who's looking to do a certain script, I'm happy to make the introduction and try to make the project happen. So, but usually they come to me, and the time to come to an attorney is when you want to protect your script. If you're a screenwriter, for intellectual property, register a copyright in your script. Or if you're going to be actually starting to enter into agreements with third parties, that's a good time to consult an attorney to make sure that you're entering into the right agreements that will protect your assets and try to minimize liabilities that you might be faced with.
What projects should use an entertainment, and what shouldn't use an attorney, kind of thing?
I mean, I think really all, and it's going to sound incredibly self-serving, so I apologize, but I think all projects should use an attorney, because the contracts are really very, very important. It can be a real catch-22 for a lot of filmmakers, a lot of creatives, because they might not have the money to hire an attorney early on, and attorneys, of course, cost money. And so it's very difficult, because sometimes we'll just want to wing it. But when you wing it, it's really, you're taking on a lot of risk, because if you take a misstep or you don't get the rights that you need in your project, and you spend a whole lot of money and a whole lot of time, and then your project gets shut down, that's disastrous. So you got to be careful.
I was going to talk to you about that as well, kind of the dangers. But like, are there projects? So you think you're kind of the opinion that if you're going to do anything on sort of any level, you need some legal help?
Well, I mean, ideally, yes, and
right.
Really, there's sort of a spectrum. I mean, I always like to bring up the spectrum. So, for those of you who are listening at home, I've got my arms in the air. So, at one end of the spectrum are like complete legal protection. The T's are crossed, the I's are dotted for people who are less risk averse. Then the other end of the spectrum is the Wild West producer with the cowboy hat, shooting from the hip. And one of my jobs as an entertainment attorney, is to try to find the sweet spot on that spectrum that fits my client's budget. So yes, ideally, I think everything should have a contract, because I've been approached by a lot of people who say, but we're just friends and we know exactly what we're doing and we would never sue each other in court. There won't be any problems here. And my answer is always the same. If you want to preserve that friendship, do a contract. I mean, there's no reason not to, because I've seen too many friendships in my own life get ruined or get put on hold for a couple of years because they weren't really on the same page as they thought they were.
You know, even something like a deal memo or something basic is really, really helpful. And then, you know, for someone like you don't necessarily litigate, so you're more in, I would say, fire prevention than fire extinguish kind of thing?
That's absolutely right. I mean, knock on wood, so far, it's been great. I haven't had any litigations come from my contracts, and I'd like to keep that streak alive. But I mean, you raise a good point. It is important to get something in writing. I mean, ideally, it should be a formal contract, or you mentioned a deal memo. And I mean, I think deal memos, in my experience, are okay for bringing out the major points in the negotiation, because if you've hit an impasse on a major point, then you've saved all that money in going to a long-form agreement. But I'm always a little bit concerned about short-form agreements or short-form deal memos that are legally binding, because there are a lot of things that don't get negotiated in them that should be there. And so a producer, for example, could really walk away with a lot of rights that are unrestricted because all that stuff is just not in that short form deal memo.
Have you seen that happen where you kind of like, because it wasn't in fine print, or if it was because it was just, paragraph A, but there wasn't like sub paragraph B, C, and D, that they didn't, someone was able to take advantage of somebody else?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen deal memos where things were a little bit half-baked and they weren't detailed enough. And so when the deal went south and one party withdrew and wasn't keeping up its end of the bargain after my client, and this, by the way, I was brought in after things went south. And so when I walked in, I'm looking at the deal memo and I'm thinking, wow, I really wish you could have consulted me before you signed this, because there would have been a really easy way to fix this. I mean, everything hinged on a budget and whether or not a budget was approved, and the language was ambiguous. And so that's why you got to be so careful. And with contracts and with deal memos, you have to be really, really precise, because unfortunately, the old saying, the devil is in the details.
Besides the contracts, though, I mean, are there other things that you guys handle in terms of that? Say, I'll give you a for instance. So let's stick with the feature film idea.
Okay.
Somebody comes to you with a feature film project. They come to you fairly early. Maybe they've got some interest in it, and they're thinking about drawing up a deal. What, at some point, like kind of where do you get the ball, and how do you, what's the process for it, type of thing? What's
Sure.
the A, B, C, and D of it? What would you do for the client?
Well, I mean, aside from negotiating, preparing contracts, I mean, one thing I can do for the client, or the entertainment attorneys do, is that quite often a producer, for example, will have a pitch deck or pitch materials that give a synopsis of the film, who their target cast is, who their target director is. Maybe there have been attachment letters that have been signed where talent or directors have been attached to the project. There could be perhaps a social benefit angle to the project, so they might talk about different partnerships and affiliations that they have with other parties can help finance it. There'll be a rough description of the budget, and also how monies get distributed, what the waterfall is going to investors. So one thing I can do at the early stage is to look at those materials and be a second set of eyes, and there are some important legal legends that you should put in there to make sure that the potential audience who's seeing that pitch material knows that this is not an offering of securities, because you don't have the securities documents ready yet. You don't want to trigger accidentally a securities offering, and that certain things.
I don't know what that is. What is a securities offering?
Well, a securities offering is one way that producers can finance a film. So basically what it is, it's selling a security to a passive investor. So basically getting someone to invest money in your film. And a passive investor is someone who's putting the money in, but who has no significant participation in the project, in making the decisions for the film, or in the production entity. So really just putting their money in, crossing their fingers, and hoping they'll get some money back and then some.
Now, I interviewed Lee for a series called Conversations on Media Production that we did here in New York. And one of the things we talked about, now that we're talking about film finance, is, and I don't want to go too into the minutia of it, because I think probably a question that a lot of viewers and listeners would have is about, okay, so there's different ways to finance films, and one of the things that you were helpful in distinguishing is like the difference between someone who's making a donation through crowdfunding,
yes,
someone who's an active investor, and somebody who you just described as a passive investor.
Exactly.
Because there are people, like, if you're an investor, you want to get your money back. Now, and like you said, there's different degrees of that. So you have active investors as well. And correct me if I'm wrong, but they would be people who are actively kind of making decisions in the process.
That's exactly right. I mean, you might have producers who have put in their own money, or you've had one producer who forms a joint venture with a second producer, where both producers are going to be actively making the decisions, and maybe they're putting in their own money as well. into the project, and so they're still considered active investors because they are making decisions, and therefore it's not a sale of a security because they're not passive.
I see. So that could probably be a whole other show in and of itself.
I'm free tomorrow night.
And then when we talked about crowdfunding, it's like that's a donation. Somebody's donating; they're not expecting money back. So if you're doing a crowdfunding campaign, people are giving you money, but you don't. I mean, other than whatever you've promised, whatever doodad that you want to send them, early screening, a pin or something. Other than that, they're not expecting money back in terms of sort of cashing in on their investment.
That's right. They're getting a deduction on their taxes for the fair market value of their
when
their
you
donation.
deal with, they can get a deduction on their taxes whether or not it's a nonprofit movie, or can you have a for-profit movie and somebody still gets a tax break when they donate? Is that possible?
Well, sure. I mean, one way that you can finance a film is through donations through a 501c3 not-for-profit company, so what's called a fiscal sponsor. And as long as your project fits within the fiscal sponsor's mission, then they can accept donations, earmark those donations for your project, and then you get that money. And that money will finance part of your project. So maybe you have a certain part of the budget that's being financed by donations. Maybe you've got some really, really generous family members and friends who just give you money as a gift. You might have to get, there are different ways to finance a film. You might have to get a loan, or of course there are a lot of different distribution style financings as well, where you basically do a pre-sale of distribution rights in your film. I think there's a book by an attorney named John Cones, which has 23 or 43 or 330,000 different ways that you can finance a film, which is pretty good background reading for filmmakers.
Right. I think that's probably one thing that a lot of people, because I've asked people online and stuff like, what do you want to hear about? And I think the most mysterious thing is film finance. Now, in terms of that stuff, so in terms of dealing with passive, active investors, where do you come in? Like, are you drawing up those agreements with those different investors and making sure that everything is fair to all parties involved, kind of thing?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say fair to all parties, because of course I have
You're on the side of the...
if I'm representing the producer, then I've got the producer's interest at heart. But at the same time, you also want to make sure that what you're giving to the other side is not something that's draconian and extreme. Otherwise, guess what? They're not going to sign it, and they're not going to give you your money.
Right.
So you want to make sure that you keep things somewhat customary. But every deal has a different negotiation. So there's no one way to do a deal. There's no cookie cutter documents that can be used. And also I should mention that you don't necessarily have to do a securities offering per se with an operating agreement for your LLC and a subscription agreement and a purchaser questionnaire, all these multiple documents. A lot of films are just doing one single agreement, just an investment agreement, which is still a securities offering, but it's just done with one document. Are
there sort of caveats in case, like what if the film doesn't make money? And, because a lot of films, I've said, like, I've talked to people, I had a crowdfunding expert on the show in one of the early seasons, and, one of the things that I thought about was, like, investing in a movie or investing in an entertainment property is like investing in magic. Because like even big budget movies don't make money. Even movies that are made by Warner Brothers, Disney, Universal Pictures, a lot of them can fall short. So if you're in the independent world, like for instance, a friend of mine used to work for Warner Brothers, and with Warner Brothers, if they want to do a movie in New York, they have an entire legal team that would set up that LLC, set up whatever investor agreements, set up those that's all take
the Golden Army.
Yeah, exactly. And you don't have and the house is basically, the foundation for the house is already built. You just have to put the bricks on top. With independent film, it's starting from scratch. And and you would probably be one of the initial bricklayers, if I'm still on that metaphor, but like setting all of that stuff up, you got to make the factory before the first product can go out the door.
Yes.
So in terms of that stuff, like, have you, like, are there protections for the filmmaker in case the film doesn't get released, doesn't get sold, and like, how do you handle that stuff?
Well, everyone knows that investing in film is a surefire bet and completely safe. Everyone is just gazillionaires. But yeah, in the agreement that's going to be signed by the investor, there are a lot of risk factors. It's basically screaming at you, you're going to lose your money. What are you, Meshuggah? What are you, crazy? Sorry, I've been watching that car commercial. So there are a lot of caveats in the agreement so that the investor knows that there is a good chance that the investor is going to lose some or all of the money, and that the investor has the has the sufficient knowledge and sophistication to make the investment, that the investor has asked all the questions that he or she needs to ask, they've seen all the documents, they've had an opportunity to consult an attorney. All of these things are in there to try to protect the producer if the picture doesn't make money. And you're quite right, a lot of movies just don't make money. I'm not even talking about Hollywood.
Yeah, I mean, if you're doing an independent film, I mean, it depends on, but especially if it's not a sellable property, like say it's a short film or it's a short documentary, it's been notoriously hard to make money on documentaries. You can get distribution for them, but to actually cash in on that distribution, you're lucky if you break even most of the time. So if you're doing it, you're kind of doing it more for the love of money, but you still need to pay for it.
Yeah.
And there are people also who guarantee completion money in films and things like that. And it's very, as far as I'm concerned, and just being around it the little bit that I have, it sounds very complicated. And I think to try to navigate those waters yourself is kind of lunacy. Like I wouldn't want to do that alone.
Yeah, it's you just have to be really, really careful. And I mean, one thing I will say, when you're not involving an attorney, I always applaud artists and filmmakers, et cetera, who like to educate themselves on business matters. I mean, I think it's a lot of self-education that you can do. There are books out there you can read. If you can't afford to pay an attorney, there are some organizations out there, for example, Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts in New York might be able to help you or might be able to connect you with an attorney who will provide pro bono services, pro bono being free, because every attorney has a certain number of hours you have to do pro bono each year. There are also some form books that you can look at as well. Now, forms are it's a double-edged sword, because there are bad forms out there, and there are some worst forms out there, and there are some good forms out there. But these forms, a lot of them are fill in the blank. And part of the value that a film attorney brings is they know how to fill in those blanks. They know what the customary ranges are, what should be paid to a screenwriter, how much time should be there for the option. So it's certainly better than nothing. I mean, to have access to those forms, and it's just great to educate yourself so that when you do work with an attorney, you're sort of speaking more of the same language, and it makes things much more streamlined.
I think that's probably one of the biggest dangers, because a lot of times I think creative folks, artistic folks, they're not as educated in business because they spent their whole life studying film or theater or whatever it was they did, and it's also I think there's a fear involved to it. Like I used to have a distinct aversion to Excel spreadsheets, and anything like that. I just, like numbers used to freak me out. And then, when I started getting into it, and it was like, dude, you got to do these. You got to be able to do this budget if you want to make this commercial. Like you got to be able to show this client this, and getting into and then the more I did it, the less scary it was. But I do think it's one of those things that people are really deficient at because of the fear and the ignorance that they have. And, it's great if you can afford somebody like Lee to do this for you, great. But, you do have to educate yourself, and you should have a business hat. And, if you don't, you will lose money. You will get screwed over in a deal. Like you're just asking for it. But, like you said, I think there's levels of degrees, levels of risk, levels of project. If it's a project that you're doing by yourself and 5 friends, and you're making the whole thing for $20, probably don't need to get an LLC for that.
That's fair.
But, if you're trying to make a feature film for any kind of real budget, there is risk involved. I think with anything, there's risk involved.
Sure, and maybe you don't have any assets to protect. Maybe you're sort of judgment proof, to use that term. But so I think it's also a good idea if you have access, and a lot of people don't. If you have access to an accountant, for example, to explore these issues as well. So whether or not now is the right time to form an LLC if you have enough to protect, because you want to protect those assets. You want the LLC to be the only pool of assets that a claimant can go after.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that can happen on a film set too that you should be protected against in
Sure.
terms of liability. And I've gotten into several situations where I was like, no, we're not doing that stunt. We're not doing that because if you don't have the kind of production insurance that you need, or you just don't want to get sued by some stranger who's walking through your film set, like it's good stuff to know. And I think it's a lot of things that people just want to make stuff now. And we live in this like DIY world, but I've kind of talked about it on the show before. When you try to do certain things at a certain level, you need that structure there. You need to have that there for your own protection and the protection of everybody who's working for you.
Yes.
And
Yes.
you know, and even like with writers and stuff, if at some point my writing partner, I get to a place where, you know, we're negotiating a deal, definitely we're going to consult an attorney, because I've seen people, you know, get screwed over on option length and, you know, rights and things like that. And, you know, you gotta read the fine print and all that stuff.
Yeah, you do, and it's hard because it's the old saying, "Penny wise and pound foolish."
Right.
So sometimes it's better to make a little bit of an investment in yourself and in your project by bringing on the right advice, the right counsel, because it could save you so much more money down the road. It can be much more expensive to get you out of trouble than it is to just keep you out of trouble from the get-go.
I think it's a great note to leave off on, because we got to wrap up. But Lee, if people want to hire you, know more about you, where can they find you on the web?
Sure. I mean, I invite you to come to my website. It's feldshonlaw.com. So I'll spell it very quickly: F for Freddie, E for Echo, L for Lucky, D for David, S for Sugar, H for Honey, O for Oscar, N for Nicholas, law.com. Also, I do offer some seminars from time to time, particularly on how to finance a film project and a live theatrical project. I think the next one's going to be sometime in June. So if you could connect to me on Facebook, to my Feldshon Law PLLC page, I can keep you apprised of any seminars that are coming up.
Fabulous. And thanks so much for coming here.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
And at some point, you know, maybe we'll do like a deeper dive. We'll do another show and we'll do a deeper dive on this stuff, because I think it's valuable information.
I'd love to.
Anyway, that's all the time we have. I'm going to say thank you, and thank you all out there for taking this trip down the rabbit hole. For more of this show, you can check the episodes out on our website, norestoftheweekendpodcast.com. You can also subscribe on whatever you're watching or listening to this on now, or on any of the major podcast apps, Anchor, iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, Spotify, et cetera, et cetera. Once again, just want to say thanks, Lee. Thanks for coming. Really appreciate it. And for Behind the Rabbit Productions, I'm Jason Godbey. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.